Awesome. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to our webinar and panel discussion today on ROI versus attribution. We're going to dig in and really get through this juicy topic. I'm Sam Melnick. I'm the Vice President of Marketing at Allocadia. So Allocadia, we're a software company that works with marketing organizations at companies like Box, Microsoft, and Land O'Lakes to actually help them measure ROI. I'm going to introduce our panelists in a moment, but before I want to dig into a little housekeeping. So today we will not have any slides. It will be a discussion and discuss if you will. If you have any questions you want answered, or you just want our opinions on this topic, toss it in the questions panel in the GoToWebinar module. If you have technical difficulties, same thing. Pop that into the chat panel. We'll have folks in the background to help you out, help figure that out. And lastly, we're recording this, so after the fact, we're going to send it along with an ebook around ROI versus attribution. Awesome. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's get into this hotly debated topic. So marketing measurement, and I'm fairly certain that all four of us, and I can speak for myself, that we're talking with customers, prospects, peers, or each other on a weekly basis on this topic. So there's plenty of questions, plenty of opinions out there, and we're fortunate to have an all-star panel of experts to discuss here. And I'm really serious. I think if I were to choose three people who are to join me, or three people I wanted to pick up the phone to call or text to ask them a question on ROI or attribution, these three folks would be top of the list. So without further ado, let me introduce the folks. So first, we've got Elle Woulfe, who's the VP of Marketing at PathFactory. So they're a content, insight, and activation platform that gives your buyers a better, faster, and easier experience. Excuse me, Elle. Sorry, I didn't spit that out well enough. And then Heidi Bullock, who's CMO over at Engagio. So that's an ABM platform that allows revenue teams to orchestrate multi-channel interactions and get insights so you can drive and improve impact across teams. And finally, Justin Gray, who's the CEO and co-founder of LeadMD, a revenue acceleration agency that focuses on revenue ops, and they have a plethora of personalized services from strategy to planning to tactics like marketing automation implementation. So great group of folks, and let's not waste any more time on the upfront and dig right in. So starting out a bit more broadly, attribution ROI, that's going to fit within the idea of measurements, marketing measurements. So I'm going to start with you, Heidi. What would you say the general state of the union as it pertains to measuring marketing effectiveness and impact is?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer that in two ways. I actually am going to give my personal opinion, and then I did a little research just to see, how true it is or not. And I think I see, maybe a small set of, early adopter type of companies that I think have an attribution model. They're using technology. They're doing it fairly well. I think that tends to be most likely the minority. I think it's a little bit of one of those things like brushing your teeth. We all need to do it. Some people skip it. They just do. And I think the majority of folks I see, I go in and talk to companies all the time, and it's something they're very aware of. They know they should do it, but they are not necessarily doing it. And I actually did some research this morning and saw eMarketer said the same thing. They did a survey with ClickZ's, and it basically looks like 10% of the market feels they're doing it well, and everybody else does not, meaning it's just not in place in the way that it should be. We'll probably get into the reasons why, but that's what I see in general. Basically, in a summary, people know they should do it, they don't, and a small subset does it pretty well. And I'd say there's even a tinier subset that probably maybe have adopted it to a point where that's the only way they make their decisions, which I don't really like.
Sure. Al, what would you add on to that one?
I think she's spot on, and it's funny to me. I mean, I started working on the demand gen team at Eloqua 10 years ago. I've been at PathFactory for 4, and before that I was at Lattice Engines. Like 10 years ago, people were talking about this stuff. And I think I will say in the past, like, I don't know, it feels like 3 years, there's been far greater adoption of at least the building the process to kind of measure stuff in this way. But it kind of cracks me up to think that like 10 years ago, people are starting to talk about this stuff, and yet we're still so low on the adoption curve. So I think, and I talk to tons of marketers who I think still use pretty basic, analytics for their marketing. I mean, they're measuring clicks and form fills and, sure, maybe funnel progression a little bit, but they're not looking at dollars in and dollars out. So it's funny that it's kind of, there's been, I think, a surge of tools that are actually pretty effective to help make this process, easier. And I think the technology came a little late, a little behind sort of the dialogue around it, but I still haven't seen like rapid adoption of that stuff. So it feels like it's early days for something we've been talking about for a very long time.
I agree.
Early, late days, early
exactly.
Occurring. Justin.
Yeah, so I'll take a step way back, because I think there are certainly tools available on the market to help you implement attribution, right? But the biggest disconnect that I see is fundamentally, what is marketing's function? And so those straight line measurements that Elle talked about in terms of clicks or conversions or maybe opportunity creation for marketing source leads, still I see the majority of marketers and their executive counterparts looking for straight line attribution, right? Like, marketing found this lead and it turned into a sales opportunity and it closed. Like, that does not happen, right? Like, or it happens very rarely. Normally there's this influence relationship, and that's really what I term marketing's function is to influence our buyer. Those are little touches, and that fundamental concept is something that most executives don't buy into still today. So if you don't have a good alignment around what marketing's actual purpose is, it's difficult to hone in on metrics that are going to display marketing's function. So I think most organizations still need to go back to square one and really educate their organizations, educate their CEOs about what marketing is actually going to produce, which is influence. It's those little touches. It's the consumption of content. It's the consumption of messaging. It's a face-to-face conversation. It's showing up at an event. All those little attributive touches add up to something larger, right? Awareness, impact, influence, and so again, I just see a lot of teams not on the same page, certainly between sales and marketing, but really more so between executive and marketing in terms of how marketing is actually going to impact the buyer's journey. And so that's where we really recommend that folks start, is you have to fundamentally set expectations around what marketing is going to be able to achieve. And then we can start bringing some of these more complex models to the table. But for the most part, I see someone putting it, the folks that are using attribution, they're bringing these complex reports and they immediately get cut down. No, that was a sales source lead. Great. That's not marketing's function. Marketing's function is more influential.
So I like that. I like the fact that it's not just that. I like the idea of bringing in influential, and I like the idea, and this is something that we talk about a lot, at least internally and sometimes with our customers, is it's defining what you're actually trying to get out of your measurements at the end. Because you can go do ROI, you could do attribution, you can do any type of measurement you want, but if there's not a purpose around it or there's not thought behind it, you're kind of just measuring for the sake of measuring. So with that in mind, how do you each personally differentiate from attribution and ROI? If you think about, you want to have a purpose behind your measurements, you actually understand what each tool is meant for. I'm going to start with you again, Heidi. How do you differentiate between attribution and ROI?
Yeah, I think you just sort of took my punchline. I always tell people, start with the question first. I think we hear a lot around, vanity metrics, terrible. We only care about, only pipeline or only close one revenue. And it's true. But to me, it goes back to, as a marketer, my early stage metrics, I still have to understand that to do course correction, right? So I always tell people, start with what your question is first, number one. Number two, then figure out who's the audience, right? So the way that I'm going to discuss ROI at the board level is going to be very different. As an example, I might have my fully loaded marketing costs, including programs and people. For that investment, what is the overall return that I can drive? That's a very, very simple example. But with my team, we actually use engagement minute attribution modeling. So we will really try to use attribution as a way to understand ROI. So for me, it always starts with the question, are we trying to understand a bigger picture, how effective is marketing overall? Are we trying to understand, hey, we just did this huge initiative with The Economist, is that working? Or is it a very, very simple question like, hey, I can do 2 paid emails, one with vendor A and one with vendor B. Historically, vendor B's perform better. So that's where I'd use ROI. So I think just, again, making this really simple takeaway for everyone watching today, always start with your question and understand what's important, and then make sure you're communicating how you're measuring that to your stakeholders, right? And I think Justin touched on that. I think most marketers, you can put in all the technology and models in the world, and if people are not bought in, it's just that software is going to sit there. So you really have to make sure it's clear what you're looking at and why. So again, like I use attribution for more of a complete understanding. Like I look at a set of close won deals. What were the commonalities that I see across all those deals? Again, like from a minutes perspective. But then we use ROI to really understand if we're doing 10 paid programs, I'm making this up, say they're all paid email programs, which of those am I seeing more effectiveness for the investment I'm putting in? That's how I look at it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Sorry for stealing your thunder, but I totally agree with the question, what are you trying to solve? Work your way backwards. Al, I think you mentioned that you've been talking about this for some of the stuff for well over 10 years now. 10 years, I'll give you the, and like, how do you differentiate?
I mean, I think that they're parts of a bigger picture. I mean, we do something similar to what Heidi said. I mean, we actually use the engagement time that we track in our own platform, which is time spent with content. That's a key metric we look at. We look at average time. We look at a thing called binge rate, how many, buyers came in and consumed multiple assets as an indicator of intent. So none of these are absolutes for us. They're diagnostic tools. I mean, we do use attribution, like, we just did our QBR. And so we'll use attribution as sort of a nice diagnostic tool to stack rank programs. Like, okay, if we've got a whole bunch of webinars or a whole bunch of live events, like how effective were each in actually driving pipe and revenue. But I do think, attribution is challenging for people because it does tend to look at things in absolutes. And to Justin's points, like marketing's goal is to influence the entire buyer's journey and to be there at all of those different stages. So we tend not to use any one metric. We look at a whole bunch of different metrics. I mean, ROI is helpful because obviously, you want to look at the investments you made, and you want to understand if I've got 2 events and I spent double on one and the yield was the same, that's gonna tell you something pretty important about the efficiency of your spend. And so I tend to think of ROI more as a planning tool as I'm thinking about how I'm going to allocate dollars. It's not the kind of thing that I look at on a daily basis. I mean, and I think, I am in full favor of all this stuff. I think it's very important. You need to know how your investments are paying off. You need to know how the programs that you're running are driving pipe and revenue and supporting your sales team and all of that stuff. But I also think like there's plenty of softer metrics that I think are very important, that I think can actually tell you a lot about how your marketing is working in real time so you can course correct. So, I mean, I differentiate, these 2 things in terms of like when and how I would use them, but I would also just say that they're not the only things.
Just great. Thank you, Al. I mean, Justin, when we were doing prep, you kind of had a more hardline stance on this. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you just can't separate the 2, right? Like attribution is the full picture. Like I want to see what were all those different touches where we engage that particular buyer or buying committee. And ROI is more centric around, that individual channel or initiative, right? Like, so yeah, they came and downloaded a piece of content that was ultimately driven by a paid ad, right? Like I'm going to be able to get that equation at that particular touch point. But on the whole, I think attribution is critical in, number one, serving up the fact that these buyers are taking so many different interactive steps with the materials that we're putting out there, whether they be, again, individual conversations or group activities or your more traditional marketing touches like content downloads and webinar attendees and so on and so forth. So like it's very important to bring both to the conversation. So I think when you start to present these complex attribution models devoid of ROI, like that's an absolute recipe for failure, and vice versa, right? Like if I'm only going to look at one touch and say, I acquired this many leads, here's my ROI on that particular activity, that's great, but that didn't get me to my end goal, right? Like it didn't get me to source pipeline or influence pipeline or closed won revenue. So I just think that they both have to be brought to the discussion. And probably the other thing that we're not touching on a ton of is, marketing is not a science. Like, there are elements of science to marketing, and you can get more intelligent over time. But like, the more you serve this up as the end all be all, the more you're going to get cut off at the knees. And so again, I think education internally is critical about both of these elements, ROI and attribution.
I think that's a great point, and I'm already going to kind of go off script here, because Al, you brought up the point about there's metrics that are softer metrics that are important. Justin, you talk about how it's not an exact science, and like when I've seen people really struggle with taking on whether it's ROI, like finding the perfect ROI equation or the perfect attribution model, honestly, the projects, they go on forever, and often they don't succeed because you're looking for perfect when there's risk in marketing. So how have you each, and I'll start with you, like how have you worked to bring in those either softer metrics or educate the organization or influence the organization to not expect it to necessarily always be one-to-one for marketing?
Yep. Yeah, I totally agree with what Justin said. And I think, it's dangerous to let the pendulum swing too far in that direction, because then what happens is you set these expectations with, whether it's your CFO or your CEO, where they believe that you should have this like absolute answer. And there is a lot of art to marketing. And I agree with that. One of the things that we do is we basically have kind of a scorecard approach. So there's like 10 metrics that we think are really important that are predictive of success. And some of it is basic. It's the basic stuff. It's funnel progression and conversion. It is time spent with content. It is attribution and ROI. And I always tend to go with a much more liberal kind of even spread. Like, I want to know what all those touches are, because to Justin's point, there's no one thing that gets somebody to buy. It's a lot of stuff that gets someone to the finish line. And I think you need to value all of those things. So, we've worked really hard to just kind of iterate on like, what are the 10 or so metrics that we think actually really matter to us? And not only tell us, are we driving pipe and revenue, but tell us, like, is our marketing effective? Is our content good? Are we doing the things that we need to do to deliver a good buyer experience? And we track those, once a quarter is when we really tend to pull all that data and look at it and react to it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Justin, you've worked with a lot of folks like across many organizations, many marketing organizations. Like, what are some of the best marketers that you've worked with? What do they do to kind of make that case, or not even case, but communicate that? And what are like the ones who struggle? Where do they trip and fall?
Yeah, so I think the ones that struggle are definitely those that still have a contentious relationship with sales, right? Like, we've done a lot of attribution model implementation, and you come back to the table, and where everyone thought marketing was producing nothing, like one particular client, like we found like $30 million in marketing influenced revenue, right? And so at least that let them get the foot in the door to have the conversation that, yes, we are affecting the revenue that's coming into this organization and the associated buying processes. When you look at that, like, that gives them that kind of scientific foundation to point to. But if you don't have an agreement between your sales staff and your sales leaders that marketing's activities are going to, again, be influential to this buying process and largely not straight line, meaning like, I'm not going to be able to give you a hot lead that just raised their hand that wasn't in our database before. Like, I run into that all the time with organizations where they're like, well, marketing didn't source that lead. Again, like some of this ABM stuff that's starting to bleed down into just good demand generation is, I think, having a solid database coverage in terms of your ideal customer profile is probably the most beneficial thing that I've seen come out of ABM, to where it's like, no, we're not going to find net new, for the most part, net new buyers that aren't in our database. It's our job to keep them in our database, and then again influence them along that buyer's journey. So the folks that are failing in these processes are those where the rest of the organization really doesn't understand their job, their impact, their role. The folks that are succeeding are where that is an open conversation, and they understand that, yeah, that new content piece that we just put out, that was as a result of what sales was asking for. Like, it was an objection in the sales process. We put it together, and now we're seeing that particular stage accelerate because of it, right? Like, that's a really advanced concept, unfortunately. Like, most people aren't looking at like stage acceleration as a function of marketing. They're still looking at marketing qualified leads.
Yeah, can I add one thing, Sam? One thing, and I think Justin touched on it a little, I think that's an area ABM has actually been helping a bit, is that people are getting a better understanding. It's not just, oh, I'm only going to be looking at first touch. I think more and more people are really sort of understanding the points we've all been making, that it's never just one thing, and being able to kind of understand it's marketing and sales together, and tools that help you see that. I'm sure, like, it sounds like Elle's tool can do that as well. Just that ability to look at marketing and sales together. We see that, and it's super clear. It's not just one team, and they both are playing a pretty big role. And I think it's making sure that you're always doing that internal marketing and people really get it. They understand, like, look, this is our job, this is what we're trying to do, and making sure that they're bought into those metrics that you're showing. I mean, I think that's why a lot of people are liking MQAs, because it's like, okay, that makes sense to me. I'm understanding we're all going after accounts. It's not just a person that may never be a buyer for us. So it's that internal marketing you always have to be doing.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And I think, I mean, Heidi, I know we had prepped a little bit around this one as well. Is there like one or two things that you've done successfully throughout your career, or you do today, that help with that education?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough, because I think one of the things we haven't said on this webinar is, it's kind of like, yeah, marketing does all these things and everyone should get that. But I think it's always easy when a business is doing really, really well. People are like, great, keep doing what you're doing, right? It's more when a business is struggling, or, hey, look, if I can only give you X amount of dollars, where are you going to put it? A marketer has to be able to answer that. So to me, I will be the first to say it's not a perfect science, but you do need some sort of framework for decision making. And I think for me, what has been helpful is, number one, being very transparent. We have a program review meeting that we do monthly, and I invite anybody to it. They're welcome to join. And so I'm like, look, guys, this isn't a black box. You're welcome to see what we do. I share that criteria. I always am trying to get input. It's hard. I mean, I'm sure people listening are like, oh gosh, more to do, but it's critical, because if people don't buy into it, that's a problem. So I think being transparent, and I think sharing that information, we share it over Slack. I do that once a month so people can see it. And then I think another thing that is important to do is also share when things are not working. One area I see marketers, I don't know, it's like sometimes it's like everything we do is amazing, and it's not true. And I think when I'm honest, like with the sales team, like, yeah, that webinar kind of, it sucked. It didn't work out so well. They appreciate, and they know that we're trying to get better and optimize. And I think having that level of transparency has been a beneficial thing for me. And just trying to, again, always get their input, making sure people know what it is you're measuring. Even a brand campaign, people are like, oh, it's too hard to measure. You can, it's different sets of things. It's like, hey, we did this. We're hoping to see, increased traffic on our website. We want to see increased engagement in target accounts. Getting that agreement, if everyone's bought in, that's a win. So it's just that communication. It's like the black box thing's not going to work.
Yeah, I agree. Alice, go ahead, Justin.
I was just going to say, like kind of the elephant in the room is, you have to have top-down marketing alignment, right? Like Heidi's working at an organization where John Miller is literally like the CEO, right? Like the dude founded Epiphany and Marketo. So like you have like a fundamental marketing centric individual in the executive seat. I think if you don't have that within your organization, like, number one, like, spend your time trying to garner that relationship and that understanding at the C level, and certainly the CEO level. But if you don't have that, I think it's going to be a really difficult
hard
battle for the rest of the organization.
Yeah. When I worked in the life sciences, which I spent a long time there, I mean, I actually had to write several proposals why we did certain marketing tactics. So Justin's right. I mean, it really is making sure that executive team, your CFO, understands. You don't just go to Dreamforce and have 10 close one deals. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah, that's great. And that kind of segues us to a couple questions that have come in from the audience, and I'm going to combine them, and they're around the idea of picking the right model, so to speak. It's like SaaS business can be anywhere from days to years, from initial touch to close one. Enterprise, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. How do you take that on? How do you choose the right models, so to speak, or the right measurements? Justin, I'll start with you.
I mean, I think it depends on the maturity of the organization, right? Like you can't go 0 to 60 and suddenly start presenting really complex models. And so I do like the notion of bringing in quality and then time, and kind of starting off with a pretty evenly weighted model. And then if you find that there's indicators that a different model, like a W-shaped model or something like that, is more impactful, like I guess that's something that you and your business need to determine. But I think Elle said it earlier, like I really do like showing a pretty distributed model based on, again, the quality of the touch, which you all have to agree upon, right? Like, and scoring helps us do so. And then the amount of time that's spent with that particular touch. So I think start with a pretty even weighting, and if you see that your model is skewed for some reason, then you can start making those more kind of diagnostic changes.
Sure. And now, what do you like? I think you've used attribution in multiple organizations. You just have your 10 different metrics you look at. Like, how would you suggest the folks in the audience that they take this on?
Well, and I'll caveat it first by saying I am also in the same position that Heidi's in. I work in a MarTech company with an executive team that totally gets this stuff, and nobody's questioning it, and everyone believes this is the right way to do it. I think you have to know quite a bit about how buyers engage with you along the path to purchase. Like, you can't really go and throw an attribution model on something that you don't have a lot of insight or intelligence about, because if you find that from first touch to close, it's actually 3 years, that's probably going to impact the way that you look at your attribution. We know quite a bit about the velocity of our sales cycle. We know a lot about sort of where people come from and how long it takes them to actually become a qualified op, and how long it takes them to close. And so using that, we've actually adapted what model works best for us. And the other, to Justin's point, we also have a pretty evolved sense of what quality interactions look like and how we evaluate them. So when we think about campaign response, we're pretty conservative in it's not an email click through, like that's not getting in there. That's not enough to qualify as a response. So you have to do a lot of work there to be like, what things actually matter. And then I'll be honest with you, we've played around with, we've used a first touch model, we've used a last touch model, we now use an even spread model, because we have just found that once we got really good at knowing what those high value, campaign responses or engagements were, it made more sense to share in that equally. But it's iteration, it's trial and error, and I don't think there's any one right way to do it necessarily. But I do think you've got to come to it with some knowledge, some inherent knowledge about what your buyer's journey looks like and how people move through it.
Yeah, I think the thing I'd add to that as well is, like, the longer your sales cycle, the more opportunities there are for almost like, I think I read something about dark touch, like the dark touches, the ones that you can't actually track, whether it's through networks, whether it's through social, whether it's through whatever it is. And you have to acknowledge that, the model's not going to be perfect in that way.
Yep. We actually use a little bit of logic in our model to essentially, we look at, there is a blackout period. If there has not been a marketing touch in a certain amount of time, we don't, but we actually do look back. And so if it's like a sales sourced, op, but we look back and there was actually a marketing touch, within, call it 90 days of when that op was created, we're going to give that marketing touch credit, because there are, to Justin's point, like, there's a lot of things that come to bear on getting somebody to that point. So we try to take as full of a picture. And I want to be really clear about this. It's not about taking credit. Like, I hate it when it enters into that conversation, like, oh, marketing should get credit for this. It's like, it's not that. It's about understanding what works so you can do more of it. So when we look back and we, apply credit to a marketing touch that happened 90 days out, even though it was technically a sales sourced op, it's not about us taking credit. It's about us evaluating the success of that touch in creating an opportunity.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, to that point, I think the more that you, and again, it comes down to internal education, right? Like, the more that you give credit, there's the notion that you're taking credit from somewhere else, right? And that is, I think, the foundation of sales and marketing misalignment, to where you're both organizations or elements of the organization are fighting over whose deal that is, like who gets credit for that revenue, right? And so you have to have that alignment at the sales and the marketing head, to ensure that we're trying to figure out what influences our buyers, and we're trying to do more of that.
That's right. Yeah.
One thing I've seen that I'll add that I think has been interesting at some of the companies that I've worked with is, you know, sometimes sales will highlight a deal when they close, and it's like, great, we just closed, you know, New Relic, super great. We've actually in those emails also included sort of what the whole journey looks like, so people can see here's where the sales touches were, here's the marketing touches, and it's kind of this subtle education, like everyone can see, yep, both teams played a role. It wasn't just that amazing event or that sales call, it was all these things. And I think even something, just to give a practical tip to people, even something as simple as that, even if your model, you know, again, I like what Elle's point was, it's not about credit, and you always have to be iterating, but just like trying to get people to see it's never just this one thing and it's everybody together, that I think is a really important message. And I actually don't think a lot of companies still get that.
Well, and I will say internally, I think that, you know, I work at a company where not everybody here is a B2B buyer. They're a B2C buyer. And so they know what it looks like to buy something on Amazon, and that makes perfect sense. But they maybe aren't as close to the inherent like complications and complexity to B2B buying. And there's a lot of people involved, and it's a really long cycle, and there are a lot of touches. We do something similar where usually once a quarter, we take like 5 deals and we just look at all the touches. It more like visually to be like, look at all the stuff that had to happen to make this occur, and as a way to try to educate people, for sure.
Right.
Yeah, I think one of the, I mean, another one of those like elephant in the room topics for me is like, and I think someone talked about it earlier in terms of like touches that you can't measure traditionally through marketing. Like this just happened to us a while back. Like I was shopping for OKR software and I happened to put it on LinkedIn, and like our buying process completely went in a different direction because I found out a dude that I knew like was working at a company that sold the software and completely derailed the existing sales process. And like I signed the contract in like 2 days. So like stuff like that, marketing just doesn't, like we don't have technology that bridges that gap. And I think that that's oftentimes one of those, you know, the area where marketing isn't a science, because some of those most impactful areas we're just not able to measure. You know, it isn't a click in an email or something like that. It's a conversation offline or via social channel that we just don't have control over. And so I think that's one of the biggest gaps in B2B buying right now from a technology standpoint.
I think about this a lot when we look at like, you know, anonymous traffic, non-referred traffic to our website. And I'm like, it came from somewhere. Like those people didn't just go like, let me go find PathFactory. Like that didn't happen. It happened because they talked to a peer, or they were at a show and they heard about it in a case study, or there's all these different points of influence that you're right. Like they are how a buyer is made. And I think sometimes when you put all your eggs in the attribution basket, you aren't valuing some of those things that are happening. I mean, you know, the reason why that person gave you that recommendation is because they had a good experience. So they were an advocate in some way. And so like, right, like there's marketing should, you know, that's an important part of what you're doing in marketing is cultivating advocates.
Yeah, I think the key is though just taking the data that you have and it's available, and it's like it's just a tool to make the best decisions that you can, right? Because all of us are in the boat where, look, you have a certain amount of budget. It's your job to invest those dollars in the best way possible. And again, it comes back to it's a framework, but I think everyone's saying it. It's not a perfect science, and if you go into it thinking it is or it ever will be, it's probably just not true.
I think one of the biggest values is you have to have someone in the organization that, and this is probably quite frankly the people who are on this webinar right now, has their pulse on has their finger on the pulse of how much buzz is building around an organization, right? Like it's intangible often. It has to be someone that is incredibly connected to the marketing cycle and can feel that like, yeah, we're doing a lot of this stuff, you know what I mean? And PR is a big element of this, content's a big element, customer marketing is a big element of it. But you can start to feel that wave build, and you understand that, yeah, we're starting to get more traction, right? But you can't point to a single metric that says, oh, my social influence score just went up to 98. You need someone that can understand that and then advocate for it internally and understand those types of intangibles that are building that brand presence.
That's why engagement's cool. It really helps with that.
So now that I have running got a cough drop. Thanks for carrying the ball, everybody. we can jump back. We can jump back in.
I told you it's not a good webinar unless someone dies.
I put the on blank because I have to go get a cough drop. That's great. I'll chalk that one up for the memories. So obviously I didn't get the entire conversation, but what I'd love to we were talking a lot about data there. And
we were talking about your shirt.
My shirt, yes.
Just kidding.
In terms of data and like in terms of organizations having challenges to understand their attribution model, like Justin, like when we did prep here, you had a lot of thoughts about why they have these challenges and particularly around data. So can you walk through some of those issues that you see people having?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like if you want all 10 marketers to agree on something, just throw out that the data is bad, right? So in any time again that you put metrics in front of an organization, or whether it's a board meeting or it's an internal sales and marketing meeting or what have you, and you put that report up there and people start analyzing it, and again, like if you don't have alignment, this is one of those things that always happens, which is like, what is this over here? What is this bucket? Well, those are the net new influence marketing leads, right? Like it's like, well, let's see what those are made up of. It's like, no, that guy, I've been talking, our sales has been talking to him for 3 months, right? You number one, again, like I'm kind of beating the internal alignment horse to death here, but like it's so critical. But number two, you have to ensure that you're taking a really intentional approach to ensuring that your ideal customer profile or your addressable market is reflected in your database in an incredibly accurate manner, right? Like people hop around, especially if you're selling to marketers, incredibly transient. So you have to put a focus on ensuring that the underlying data is solid, or any sort of reporting that you build on top of that is obviously going to crumble.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I had this one person told me once that with the data and any models you're building, the people they start with, they say your data sucks, then they say your model sucks, and then when they want to argue more, they say you suck. But it's kind of the progression of what you have to solve for. Get the data correct, get the model correct, and then it's then you get.
Can I add one thing there? I think it helps to also just sort of work backwards. And I think most of us here are using some type of marketing automation. And I always kind of have the saying, like, if it's not really in a program or not captured somewhere, it's going to be really hard to kind of track that the whole way through. Or if you're not using UTMs, I mean, I just think it's like if you start like kind of at the inception of any program, ask the question, how will this be tracked? Like even a brand campaign, it's like, okay, cool, we're doing this. What are the things that we need to be thoughtful about up front? And I think if you have that as a strategy, it helps a lot of this. Because I've never worked anywhere, I've never talked to a marketer that's like, data's perfect. It will never happen. That's a bold statement, but I can't think of any company where it's like, oh yeah, all our CRM data is perfect, everything's great. I mean, you can make it better, but I think it's that's why we're saying it's not a perfect science. Like nothing will be perfect, but if you can get overall trends and you can start to see things are in a particular direction, it's helpful. But I think it's at the beginning of any initiative or program, you have to think about how are we tracking this? And a lot of people don't. And then it's like an afterthought and then they're in trouble.
No, I think that's good. Elle, in terms of where people struggle to understand the attribution of their programs, like what are you seeing? What do you see?
Well, I mean, I think it goes to what we've talked about a lot. Like if you don't, it's any place I've seen this stuff work. And this goes not just to attribution, but just to like effective sales and marketing alignment and funnel management and all that stuff. It's been top down. It's like a place I've worked. I mean, I worked at Eloqua where it was just like a mandate that this is how the world was going to work. And we were all going to do this together. And that was it. I mean, there's still a shocking number of organizations that like, they think that all of this stuff is like, voodoo. And it's like, well, it is if you don't put the right, focus and energy and like, but there is a way to do it. And it starts with, having the right process and the right, governance for how you manage data and all of that stuff. Just, it's not surprising to me that there is this systemic distrust of marketing data out there. But I mean, it's like, you have to start early and you have to build this foundation that you feel confident drawing on. Like it doesn't just, you don't will it into existence, you have to build it. But even with that, and I mean, I think we have really locked down process here. I mean, I was lucky to come here when we were a tiny company and build everything from the ground up. I got to architect all of it the way I wanted to. And I had the benefit of having seen what good looked like. So I had a blueprint for how to do it. And to be honest with you, we built up the marketing infrastructure and process and before we ever did much on the sales side, right? So, but even with all that, knowing it's good and knowing there's great quality, I still sometimes are like, I'll look at something and be like, that seems insane. That can't be right. I do think people have to get, again, this desire for like absolutes and like I'm okay with things being directionally accurate because it still tells me something important, right? So I think you've got to be a little comfortable with the squishy bits and the softer stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think an old boss of mine, she said, marketing, it's not spend, it's an investment, because some of it's going to work, some of it's not, but directionally you want it to be successful. You want a return on your investment. You want progress within the buyer's journey. In the same way with the data, it's like the data is not going to tell the full story necessarily, but if you can get information that helps you make those investments and directionally point you in the right way, then you're on the right path. So I have one question from the audience. I'm gonna actually ask Elle just to quickly dig into it, and I think we'll have one more question that will go around the horn. So Elle, somebody had asked about those 10 metrics. What I'd love for you is, can you just tell us a little bit of how you landed on those, and was it on the first pass or was it an iteration? Like, how did you get there?
Magic. It was magic. Oh no, I mean, I'm coming up on my 4-year anniversary here, and I mean, we have literally so at one point we built this CMO scorecard. I had seen this beautiful CMO scorecard that somebody had created, and it had I don't know, 50 metrics on it. And so we did 50 metrics, and I was like, oh my God, my brain can't process all this. And I don't think all of it matters. I mean, so part of it is, it's part of our goal setting process, to be honest with you. I mean, we have a couple of evergreen goals and part of it is, it's conversion and it's demand focus, it's ops and conversion and all that stuff. But then we actually set a couple of other goals that are a little bit more project oriented every quarter to try to move the needle in specific areas. But I always tie them to where will we see it from a performance? Will we see it in site traffic? Will we see it in velocity? Where do we expect the impact to come from? So some of those 10 things that we look at will be tied to some of those specific projects. Some of them are things that we philosophically believe are important. I mean, the PathFactory platform tracks specific time spent with each individual asset, right? Oh, you came and you watched this video for 3 minutes, then you looked at this ebook for 5 minutes. And so we care a lot about how that is a signal of intent. And so we calculate, like I said, binge rate. We calculate average time spent with content. And these things tell us about the quality of the programs we create. If somebody's coming and spending a lot of time consuming information, we're probably doing a good job of creating the information they need. But it's definitely, no, it's not. This is, and at least once a quarter, I'm like, I don't care about that thing anymore. That's not telling me anything. It's not useful. Let's find a thing that works a little bit better. Part of it is just the evolution of us and our company and our market. And these things have changed over the past 4 years. We were a very early stage company when I joined. We are now a growth stage company. We have lots of customers. And so the leading indicators they will inherently change for you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. Kind of continue to iterate, but find those evergreen ones. I also liked your point on them. They tie to metrics, so that this is the idea that we talk about at Allocadia. Some of our customers do. Sometimes ROI is return on intent. It's the idea that you're not going to be able to get that direct one-to-one. So can I influence whatever engagement, moving someone from a stage of the buyer's journey, or even just are we focused on the right goal, overarching goal or focus? I mean, some of earlier maturity companies will do that. Are we putting our time and money towards what we said we would? And that's a step one. Obviously, that's not the final step. So that's good stuff. All right, so last question here. So instead of giving takeaways of what to do, I'd love to start with Heidi. What are the danger zones of using ROI or attribution models? What should people look out for and avoid in their measurement travels?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've touched on this a little bit already, but to me, it's just using it as an end-all be-all. Oh, we've absolutely got, need to do this particular campaign again because we saw first touch was, 10 times or something like that. I think that I've seen it, actually, I can think of a company in particular that I've talked to, and they almost have fear. Like if they can't measure something and show that impact, they're fearful to move forward. And I think they've got themselves in a situation where it's like they're so metrics driven. It's like if they don't have that particular number, they actually kind of don't move projects forward. And so I think we've all said it on this webinar. I mean, I think you want to use it as a framework in a way that helps you make decisions, but you still have to apply your brain. You still have to use your experience and your knowledge and kind of go, like Elle said it, sometimes you look at data and you're like, that doesn't really make sense to me. There's probably something I need to dig into. All of us sitting here have done that. You've looked at, a particular program and often there's something wrong and you find that out, right? But you have to have that experience to know it. But I think the danger is, number one, just using it as an end all be all. Another danger is sort of just paralysis, like where you don't ever start and do anything. You're just like, it's too hard. I don't know which thing to put in place. It's like, just start simple. Do something as simple as possible. Like, hey, we're just going to measure these particular channels. We're just going to get going. We're going to get X amount done this quarter, and we're going to assign Sarah to get this done. I mean, I think you need to figure out who's going to do it, what your goals are each month, and then pick a small set of metrics. Like for us, we look at, for our target accounts, we look at, coverage, awareness. Are we getting meetings? What's the pipeline like? And like, what are the stages? Done. That's it, right? And then we have another set of metrics that we look at, just for the marketing team, because like I said, I actually do care about click-through rates. I do, because if my emails are bad, I want to know that. I care about my engagement on the website. My board doesn't, but I do. So I think to me, it's like also just know your audience. I can't stress that enough. I think there's times that people will care about certain details and it's important, and other times it's less relevant for the conversation. Those are kind of my thoughts on that.
Sure. And Justin, your danger zones when it comes to this?
So I think the biggest inherent danger zone for marketing metrics in general is that it's a rear view mirror. Like I'll give you the everyone who's tuned in or listens to this, like I'll give you the number one secret to marketing. Like your most successful campaign will be the one that no one else has ever done, that no one's seen anything like it, and is the most creative, attractive thing ever. And if you're always looking in the rearview mirror on like, oh, we did this thing and it was really successful and I'm going to do it again, like that's the problem. Like marketing is creative and it's innovative, and it's like people want to see that thing that's like, whoa, I can't believe a B2B company is doing this, right? Like, and if we're always looking at like the scientific approach and we're forgetting that creative side of the brain, marketing becomes just watered down formulaic BS, right? Like, which is what we don't want. Like you get that invite in your, or that piece of content in your inbox. It's like, all right, great. Like I've got 50,000 of those things like that I'm never going to read. So you need to be able to consume those insights, understand, the subjects and the topics that your buyer cares about, but then inform something that is new based on those metrics. So, just don't get stuck in the rearview mirror.
I have nothing to add to this conversation right now. It's like, yep, that. I mean, I think you're totally right. It's like the minute you start to get paralysis around, oh, we ran this webinar, it was really successful. So what, you're going to do it again? I mean, it should inform what you do in the future. I think we've learned a lot of things looking at some of these metrics about what types of things are successful or what types of things our buyers are likely to be interested in and engage with. But that doesn't mean I'm going to pick it up and do it again. I might do something similar, or I use that as a sort of guiding, insight. So I think you're totally right. Like, don't live in the past. I mean, it makes sense, we sponsor Serious Decisions coming up in a week or two, and it's a huge investment for us. We spend a ton of money on it. And so yes, we're going to look at what we got out of that. But we also look at, okay, we've sponsored Serious Decisions over the past few years. Like what do we think about that investment as a whole? And sometimes it takes somebody 18 months from when we talked about Serious Decisions to become an opportunity. Like, make sure we're looking at the long tail of that. I mean, I think the biggest thing is, it's all the stuff we've said. The danger is, don't go trying to slap some super complicated, attribution philosophy into a company that isn't going to adopt it or buy into it or believe it, right? Like, that's like, I had this frustration at a company that I worked at that shall remain nameless, where marketing was the only group that cared about the marketing data. It was, and to Heidi's point, who cares? Like, I still need to make decisions. I still wanted the marketing to be good. I was still going to use that insight to do things with. But what I learned was my audience was not the CEO, because he didn't care, right? So you have to be conscious of that stuff. And yeah, there are plenty of metrics that, look, I may not be looking at those individual campaign response rates and click-through rates and all that stuff every day, but I'll tell you what, my team is, because they're running tons of programs and they want them to be better every time. And we do tons of, testing and optimization. And so it's not just this, like, this is a piece of it, and it's great to get there, but there's a million other things that you can look at in marketing that can help you to create better marketing.
Can I add one more thing? Sorry. I think that the reason is people, they need to look at that stuff, because often, you guys, like, that's when you see something's really wrong. Like, if you're looking at maybe a campaign and you're like, wow, no one has opened or clicked this, like, and that's a simple email example, but I still see it to this day, where if you're not looking at that stuff, there can actually be mistakes or things that didn't get executed in the way you thought. And ideally, if you are using metrics well, you can build forward-looking models. Like, I actually really believe in that. If you are doing it well, you can start to get a sense of, these types of things work. And I might disagree a little bit with what Justin said. I've definitely, I think, in marketing seen where, your buyer, they evolve, they change. The person that buys our product today, I'm still marketing to another audience that's completely new or hasn't maybe looked at our products and services tomorrow. And I think sometimes in marketing, I see where people fall into a trap of, like, we've always got to do something crazy and exciting, which I love, trust me. But I've also seen it, where certain things do continue to perform and work. And I don't know, I've seen it where you don't always have to reinvent the wheel when something is working, because you are marketing to a different group of people over time. But just my perspective on that.
Yeah, I think it has to be buyer driven, right? Like, that's what it all comes down to. What does my buyer want? Are they fatigued with what everyone's putting in front of them, or are they lapping this up? And I've got a whole nother wave of buyers that is that second round of the latter adopter and so on. So I mean, if the buyer isn't the focus of all of your decision making, I would argue that you're looking in the wrong spot.
Amen.
There you go. And with that, I guess we'll conclude. So I want to thank Heidi, Justin, Elle. Great conversation, great information. I hope everyone listening got something out of this.